we're all working from the same set of physics. It's not like I like this physics better than that physics. And then, trying to really understand growth on kind of a scientific level. How do you influence it, accelerate it? That's where the discussion should be, not on, should we call it this or should we call it that? It should really be how does growth actually work?
Hi, welcome to the Product Compass podcast. My name is Paweł Churyn. Today my guest is Sean Ellis, the author of international bestseller Hacking Growth with over 1 million sold copies. Sean popularized the dorsal metric. His approach propelled breakthrough growth at companies like Facebook, Airbnb, and Dropbox. Today we discuss what growth hacking is, implementing the high-velocity test-learn process, building and reinforcing the right habits, and the scientific approach to growth. Are you ready? Great. So let's get into it right now.
Okay, Sean, thank you much for being here. Welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you. I'm excited to be on with you to talk about growth.
And I'm excited to have you on. Sean, you are the founder of Growth Hackers. You're co-author of Hacking Growth, and you are, by the way, great book that I highly recommend. You've been the growth marketing leader at many companies which valuation exceed $1 million, like Dropbox, Eventbrite, Logmail, and Lookout. You also coined the term growth hacking, which you used to ignite massive growth of those companies that I mentioned. So I thought that maybe we can start with the question, what is growth hacking?
And maybe what it is not?
Sure. Yeah, I think kind of the simplest definition is that it's taking a rigorous process of testing and analyzing to unlock growth in a business. So you could potentially say that really just describes marketing done well these days. And so I think the other place that for growth hacking to be effective is that you're doing it not just on the customer acquisition side, but you're doing it across really all of the levers of growth. So acquisition, new customer activation, engagement and retention. How do I keep customers coming back? How do I get existing customers to bring in new customers? Even optimizing the revenue model, and all of those levers kind of working together through that test learn process to improve growth as much as possible.
Are there any competences that you need to start? You mentioned marketing, you mentioned pricing, there is an acquisition, there is retention, we need to activate customers. So I imagine that we need many competencies from different areas to ignite this growth.
Yeah, so, you mentioned some of the companies that I had worked with. And so in most of those companies, I started out as kind of the only guy who was doing it. And so, Dropbox was less than 10 employees when I was there. Everyone else was core product. And so, so obviously I needed a lot of skills. And then as teams grow, then I can hire some of those skills, and become kind of more specialized. But, so I would say for a pretty early stage startup, you probably want to have one person that's fairly dynamic and can do a lot of things. At the very base, I think that the most important skill is probably, kind of discipline to follow a process, and then somewhat analytical so that you're actually able to see what works, and then creative in the sense of you're coming up with ideas of things to test, but ideally, you're not just randomly coming up with ideas. They're based on talking to customers or somehow processing customer insights. And so you need to be somewhat kind of curious on the customer side as well. And so those would be, I get at the base. So curious about customers, ability to come up with ideas, and then follow a testing process, and then be able to analyze the results and make the right decisions based on the things you've tested.
Yeah, you mentioned many topics that I would like to ask you about. I can relate to this experience because I was also running a startup. I remember doing everything from many different areas. So at the beginning, before we hired more specialists, it was quite challenging. Are there any prerequisites to start thinking about growth, start thinking about scaling your company?
Right.
Maybe you can do it anytime.
Yeah, I mean, so start thinking about growth. You should really start from day one, and that's kind of like does anyone need what we've built? Let's go out and or what we plan to build. Let's go out and kind of talk to some customers and see how they solve the problem we're trying to solve today. And so I think you're thinking about growth from pretty early on, but the prerequisites for actually executing that test learn process, that growth hacking process, you want to make sure that you have, I mean, not to be too jargony, but you have product market fit, which I'll explain. So we're not just leaning on some jargon there, but so you essentially you have a product that is a must-have for some segment of users that you can go out and reach. And so if there's a group of users that say once they try the product, they say, "Wow, I really need this product. I'm gonna keep using this product." Then you have the prerequisite to say, okay, now I need to be aggressive about getting a lot more people to come in and try it and hopefully use it in the right way.
You mentioned segments, and you mentioned that people saying that they would like to use the product. So is there any way that you can actually measure or test that you achieved the product market fit?
Well, there's a couple of ways. So one, the most accurate way to measure it is if they keep using the product. So that would be a retention cohort. So for every 100 people who come in and try the product, over a period of time, are they continuing to use it? And so you're never going to have all 100 people stay on the product. So after a few hours or days, depending on the kind of nature of the product, you're going to lose some percentage of those people. But what product market fit looks like is that eventually you get to a point where, say, 3 or 4 weeks into it, I still have half of the people who tried it and they're using the product. And then I look 2 months later, those half of the people are still using the product. And so you're able to retain some percentage of the people who try the product in the long term. So that the problem with that approach to validating product market fit is that it could take you several months to be able to see what happens to those retention cohorts. So I came up with a question, that's probably almost 15 years ago now, which was, if I just ask the people who are using the product, how would they feel if they could no longer use the product? And I gave them the choice, very disappointed, somewhat disappointed, or not disappointed, or even not applicable. I already stopped using the product. If people say they would be very disappointed without the product, there's a very good chance they're going to keep using the product long term. And so that's a way to kind of get a shortcut way to figure out, okay, who am I likely to retain? Of course, if they say they're going to keep using the product and they actually stop using it, their behavior is more important than what they're saying. And so that's why I say it's more accurate to actually use retention cohorts to make that decision. But you get a faster read by just asking that survey question.
Yeah, I like this distinction between what people say and what people actually do, because this is a common in product discovery, also in working in core product teams, that
Right.
It's not necessarily the case that what people say is what they will do in the future.
Right.
So let's say you achieve the product market fit through those retention cohorts. You see that customers are staying, retaining, and keep using your product. What can we do next to accelerate this growth?
Yeah. So the next thing I want to do is not just have product market fit, but actually understand it. So that's where I want to be able to narrow down to see exactly who says they'd be very disappointed without the product. So this is the benefit when you're using the survey approach, is that you can really start to dig into some qualitative information a lot more, where if you're just using retention cohorts, you don't necessarily know why they're using it or what they were using before. But with a survey, you can add other questions where you start to identify, okay, there's a lot of people who try the product who stop using it right away. And what are the characteristics of those people versus the ones who actually keep using it? So you start to identify, okay, who's my target customer? And then you can also figure out that this is probably the most important question when I do the survey is, asking them what is the primary benefit that they get from the product. And so if I have a lot of early users on a product, then I can kind of do it across multiple surveys. So I'll start with an open-ended question. So like just get write-ins from a lot of people. And then that gives me an idea what are the main patterns I'm seeing there. And then I'll narrow down to giving people, the next group of people, a choice of 3 or 4 different benefits that they could choose from. But once I know what the core benefit is, and then I can drill into understanding why that benefit's important to them, I can focus on messaging that highlights that benefit. So I'm actually setting the right expectations about what the product's going to do for people. And so if you contrast that to a mistake that I see a lot of people making, is that they'll think, okay, growth hacking is about testing, so I'm just going to A/B test a whole bunch of messaging. And maybe they end up finding a message that gets a lot of people to sign up for the product, but that message isn't related to why people ultimately end up loving the product. And so you start attracting the wrong type of people. So it's better to figure out, okay, who loves the product? Why do they love it? Let me build a set of messaging that highlights those key benefits the product's really good at delivering. Now I'm acquiring the right type of people. And then the next question is, how do I get those people to the right experience inside the product? And that's a lot of what the onboarding becomes about, is ultimately what's the first time they really experience that core benefit. We would call that the aha moment. And so that's a key part of activation. So if you can get a new user where you've set the right expectations and now you streamline their ability to use the product in the right way and experience that benefit, now you're much more likely to long-term retain that customer. And so I spend most of my early time getting the messaging right and getting the onboarding right to get someone to the right experience in the product as quickly as possible.
Okay, so for on the one hand, we have this feedback loop on the value proposition, because from my perspective, when you start building a product, you should already assume that what is your value proposition and talk to the customers and define what the value proposition will be and which problems you will solve. But then you get this feedback from the customers after they start using the product, what actually main benefit is for them, and then you can refine your strategy, right?
Yeah, I actually have a great example about that where I worked with a mobile security application years ago, probably almost 15 years ago now, where I asked the question, how would you feel if you could no longer use the product? And I'd already committed to work with the company for 6 months in an interim role, and only 6 or 8% of the people came back and said that they would be very disappointed without the product. And so typically what I was seeing is, like, for Dropbox or Eventbrite, some of the companies I worked on before, it was 40, 50% of the people saying they'd be very disappointed. So I saw that 8%, and I was like, oh crap, this is probably not a company I should have committed to. But what we were able to do was study the 8% who said they'd be very disappointed, do exactly what we just talked about, and essentially reposition on that benefit. And then, so just with a slight message change and then a little bit of the onboarding. So the product did 3 or 4 things, but there was only one that people really were focused on. So it was an antivirus functionality. There was a suite of security tools, but the antivirus was actually what people valued the most. And so we streamlined the onboarding to that. So that's pretty easy product development. We didn't have to develop something new. We just had to hide some things in the onboarding. And then we surveyed the next group of people who went through this new sign up flow with different messaging and quickly getting into setting up antivirus. And it was 40%. So it only took us like 2 weeks to move from 8% of the users considering it a must have to 40%. And then 6 months later, it was at 60% of all users said they'd be very disappointed without the product. And it was probably within about 2 or 3 years from then, the company was in the press at raising a round of financing at $1 billion. So I think it's one of those things that, like I said, I almost quit the role when I saw how undervalued the product was from those early users. But once we figured out what the product was truly great at delivering, we were able to build a flywheel of growth around setting the right expectations and getting people to the right product experience.
So, yeah, I love the example. Did you also targeted this product to different customer segments, or it was just different onboarding?
No, I mean, in a sense, the messaging became a filter. So, and that's where again, the mistake of just A/B testing for the highest response rate can maybe attract the wrong people. But by focusing on the benefit the product was truly great at delivering, people who weren't interested in that benefit bounced. They didn't sign up. So it was only attracting the people who were interested in that. And that's so in a sense, we targeted different people because we converted different people, but we didn't change anything in terms of the channels that we were targeting at that point. It was a fairly organic growth engine. So there wasn't a lot we could do to change the people hitting the website anyway.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had a different experience with sales, targeting as many customers as possible and grasping every opportunity on the market just to increase sales. And then it turns out that only some small customer segment those are our key customers that we make actually profits on them, and the rest is then it's churn or they are not satisfied with the product.
Exactly, and that's why when we're talking about like the prerequisite for growth being product market fit essentially means that you've identified the right type of customers and the right experience on the product that makes it a must-have. And so if you aggressively try to grow before you've done that, you're going to do exactly what you just said. You're going to cast too wide of a net, promise the product being everything that anyone could possibly want, and then have a frustrated sales team or just a bad conversion rate of people who maybe you're actually able to convert them in the short term, but they all stop using the product after 30 days because it just doesn't meet their needs. And so that's the key, is just figuring out what is that use case for the people who really need the product, and how to get those right people using the product in the right way. And that is going to lead to a retained customer base that ultimately allows you to build a sustainable growth engine.
Yeah, amazing. So it's not just about testing random ideas and checking what works, but actually some work required before you start investing in scaling, so that you understand the problem that you are solving, and then you can think about solving this problem or maybe improving in some areas. Sean, you mentioned growth process. Could you quickly tell me how it works?
Sure. So I'll even kind of back up a little bit on, you had mentioned I coined the term growth hacking, and so a lot of people also then say you invented growth hacking, but ultimately growth hacking is just simply the scientific method that has, can trace its roots to ancient Greek times. And it's about having, most of us learned about the scientific method when we were in school, and it's about having a hypothesis, and you test that hypothesis in an experiment, and then you learn if the hypothesis were true or not. That's really the process that we're talking about here. So most of the time, the scientific method is applied to like innovation, trying to figure out, a cure for cancer, or, whatever you're trying a lot of things to try to achieve an outcome. In this case, we're trying to achieve a growth metric generally. It might be like a conversion rate if it's, a specific point in the funnel, but we are also innovating here. We're coming up with better ways to attract, convert, and retain customers. And so that's, you want to generate a big backlog of ideas. So it all starts with the recognition that probably every single thing you're doing, you started with someone's guess of this is how we should do the messaging on the page. This is how we should make the sign up process. This is how we should have someone get started with the product, and the chances that those guesses are the best possible way you could do something is basically zero. And so the only way to drive improvement on those initial guesses is by trying a bunch of things. And so you come up with a lot of ideas of the things you could potentially try. You need a system for prioritizing which ideas that you want to run. And so I came up with a scoring system years ago, probably 6 or 7 years ago, called ICE scoring, where each idea is scored on its potential impact. And then, so if it's successful, how impactful will it be on the business or the objective? And then confidence, how confident am I that it will be successful? Do we have some evidence that suggests that other tests like this worked, or with some customer research that says, okay, this test is really solving something the customer's struggling with? But kind of scoring that on a scale of 1 to 10. And then the last one is ease. So ICE, ease is just how easy is it to run this test? And the ease, is going to often be around the team's creativity. Like, there's always a more complicated way to run a test. And so what's sort of the simplest way you can run the test where you're going to get a pretty accurate result? And so, you may initially say, oh gosh, on an ease score, this is not going to be very easy. We're going to give it a low ease score of, say, a 2 or a 3. But then someone says, wait, if we just did it this way, we get the answer, and that's actually really easy to implement. So maybe it then goes up to an 8 or a 9. So what you're trying to do is have ideas that are very high potential impact, and then you have a lot of confidence that it's actually going to work, and they're really easy to test. And so those are probably the types of ideas you want to run first. And then the growth process is really just running the test, analyzing the results. And the more tests you run, the more learning you generally get. And even when something doesn't work, you get smarter about what works and what doesn't work. And you start to see an incremental increase in your growth rate with each new test that actually it works as an improvement on one of the key levers in your growth engine.
Mm-hmm. So the amount of tests that you run regularly, I guess this is important, right? So that it also correlates to the speed, how fast you can learn.
Yeah, I mean, like Jeff Bezos at Amazon has a great quote. He just says, our success at Amazon is a function of how many tests we run per day, per week, per month. And so, the former CEO, the founder of Amazon, but he's goes back and forth as being the richest person in the world, and one of the most successful companies in the world. And he's literally saying their success at that company is a function of how many experiments they run. And so I think all of us should look at that and say, how do we run more experiments to increase our ability to learn more quickly about what works and doesn't work to drive value for customers?
I previously noted a specific question about ICE score. Ease of testing the idea, is it the cost of implementing the whole idea, or is it the cost to run a test, like a simplified version of an idea, maybe a prototype, maybe a feature stub?
Yeah, it's the cost to get the answer. So the answer is going to be, what's the simplest way you can implement that idea to figure out if it works. Once you have the answer, the long term, maybe it requires some fairly heavy investment to capitalize on that answer and make it a long-term contributor to the growth engine. But the E should be around, is it easy to figure out if this makes a difference or not to the business?
There's one thing I'm trying to understand. In ICE score, there is an impact, and Sean, you told that this is an impact on the business, and the metrics that we work on are often related to the business, like revenue or acquisition or conversion. This is not related to the value for the customers. And on the other hand, you popularized the term of the North Star metric, which focuses on the value for the customers.
Sure.
Is there any way to combine those metrics, or which metrics should we focus on as a growth team, as a product team, as an organization?
Yeah, I think they are combined. So if you're thinking of the North Star metric as value to the customer in terms of average value, then you're probably thinking about the North Star metric wrong. But if you're thinking about it as the aggregate amount of value being delivered to customers, then you take all of the submetrics like acquisition, and you start to say, well, if I get 10 times as many customers experiencing the product, then I just created 10 times as much aggregate value. And so what it turns out is that usually it's not just a matter of saying, okay, I'm going to get 10 times as many people to sign up for the product. If those people have a very low conversion rate to actually experiencing the product in the right way, then they're not going to actually increase the footprint of value very much. So that's where activation comes in. Now I'm trying to get more people to experience the product in the right way. And so even revenue, you might say, okay, the revenue loop doesn't really contribute, but if you're able to generate twice as much revenue per customer on the product, then you have more money to invest in customer acquisition, which then it helps you expand the footprint of value that you're delivering. So maybe revenue doesn't directly contribute to value, but it provides more resources so that you can grow that value footprint.
Mm-hmm. I saw the presentation of Itamar Gilad recently that he described this model in which product has two functions. One is creating value, and the second is capturing value that you create. So,
right.
Yeah, revenue is about capturing value, but then you can reinvest this value to create even more value for the customers.
Exactly.
So it seems very logical that you have this scientific process. You have goals that you mentioned, or metrics that you would like to move. And then you have ideas, you have a backlog of ideas, you have experiments. You run those tests to validate and invalidate your ideas. So what can go wrong? It seems quite simple and easy to understand.
Right. It seems completely simple. And so when I wrote my book, it kind of lays all of this out, and I agree. It seems very easy. And so, teams would read the book, CEOs would read the book, and then they would go and try to do it, and most of them would fail. And so it turns out that it's not as easy as it looks. And there's, I think, a couple of reasons. So first is when we talk about that growth engine, we're talking about customer acquisition, customer activation. How do I engage customers? How do I monetize customers? Each one of those things tends to be controlled by different teams within the company. And so acquisition might be traditionally controlled by the marketing team. Conversion, kind of for a lot of companies, wasn't really controlled by anybody. It sort of sat in between product and marketing and was not even addressed. But engagement and kind of retention of customers was more of a metric for a core product team. Maybe a sales team might have something to do with the revenue loop. If it's an e-commerce business or something that's completely online, it's going to maybe sit more inside product. And then when you're running these experiments, you often need engineering to help. You often need designers to help. You need data people to give you feedback. And what it turns out is that most of these functions within a business are used to operating fairly autonomously from each other. And so even if, let's say you got a brand new business, even it may just mean that they have habits from their old companies where they worked autonomously from each other. And so, but particularly if you've got a 10-year-old business or a 20-year-old business, and you have kind of fiefdoms that have grown within the business, it just turns out to be really hard to run experiments across each of these levers. So what you see a lot of times is that like growth marketing will emerge as a discipline, but it's really just pushing that team more and more to the top of funnel, where now they're just running a marketing function. They just have a different name. It's called growth marketing instead of marketing, but it's still just testing new ways to acquire customers or bring them into the top of the funnel. And so that's where it falls apart. And so what I've found really is effective for overcoming that cross-functional challenge is to get these functional leads together in the room for a full day to make some of these key decisions. So what can they all agree on? Generally, they can agree on, okay, who's the customer? What's the need? how are we satisfying that need? Why is what we're doing even important? And starts to kind of come down to the mission side of the business. And then once they agree on the mission, then they can usually agree on what a North Star metric should be. Then they can start to move closer to what does the growth engine look like? If they all have their own view where, the sales team is saying the growth engine is entirely a function of what the sales team does, and the marketing team has a different view on what that growth engine looks like, and the product team has a different view, it's going to be really hard to work together. So they have to come together and combine their perspectives to have sort of a shared vision of how does this business actually grow. Once they're all on the same page, then looking at the growth process and agreeing how they can work together to execute that growth process becomes the next step. So ultimately it is, if you can get the right people in a room together, even if it's just like for a couple of hours, but I think a full day tends to be the right amount of time to agree on how they're going to work together effectively to execute this growth process around an engine where they've agreed what that shared North Star metric is, and they're on the same page with everything, then they have a good chance of being successful. And so that's been a lot of my focus for the last probably 4 or 5 years is what's the optimal way to run that as a workshop and get people working effectively together on the growth process. Then the other thing that I've found that I think is a really common failure point is that you do need one person leading the growth efforts. And so that might often is, just a head of growth role, and the getting the right skill set in that head of growth role is really tough because you basically need almost two opposite skills to do it effectively. One of the skills is you need to be really aggressive because you essentially have people who've got their own areas of influence that if you're not aggressive, they're just going to squeeze you out of their area of influence. So I'm running growth, but I can't do anything with the product, or I'm running growth, but I can't do anything with marketing. I'm running growth, but I can't do anything with pricing. So you have to have access to all of those things, but you also have to be then very diplomatic about it. And so if you go in and you just start messing with someone else's area of responsibility and you're not explaining why it's important and you're not getting their input on how to best approach it, then you're going to probably anger a lot of people who would then, again, squeeze you out. And so what I found is that most people are either too diplomatic and then they do nothing, or they're too aggressive and they anger everyone. So you have to kind of find that balance there. So if you do the workshop and you have the right growth leaders that's got that balance of diplomatic and aggressive, then I think you've got a pretty good chance of being successful with growth.
Can you somehow increase the chances of success, like, for example, by setting common goals in the organization, or maybe building the right culture?
I think building the right culture is the right objective there, but it's really like, how do you build the culture? Do you just create a PowerPoint deck that says this is our culture, or is it something that requires more effort? And I think culture is essentially becomes sort of values and habits. So if you have a common set of values and then the habits that support those values are consistent with those values, then that starts to become culture. So that's where I think you have to focus on habits before you focus on culture. And the habits are, there's certain things like just the language you use in the business. We talk about this in Go Practice, the online course that I run with Oleg Yakubenkov, where you learn the language of hypotheses. Right now, in a lot of companies, people just state their opinions as facts, and that's where a lot of this falls apart. When an opinion is not a fact, state it as hypothesis. My hypothesis is that people are churning because they're not getting enough value. My hypothesis is that there's a big opportunity in accountants for our product, and because they're an underserved part of the, like, all of these kind of guesses, if you use the language of hypotheses, then you're much more likely to say, okay, how do we validate that hypothesis or invalidate that hypothesis? And you become a lot more flexible in how you execute. So building the right culture can just come down to some of the language things, but But ultimately, I think it's the testing habit is what builds the culture. And how do you maintain a good testing habit? You need to be able to have reinforcement by getting some wins from those tests. And so if you run 20 tests as a team and you put a lot of effort into those tests and none of those tests drive the desired result, you're very unlikely to be able to keep a rigorous testing process going. And so it becomes really important to do that upfront analysis to say, we have a big drop off in the sign up to usage, or a big drop off in people coming back to use after that first time. But wherever that opportunity is, if you can really contextualize it, understand why the behavior you're trying to drive from users is not happening, and then come up with some test ideas based on really good research, you're much more likely to have a higher success rate from those tests. And that success rate is going to be what reinforces the behavior from the team to keep wanting to run more tests. And so, a habit of testing, and to keep that habit of testing going, you're going to need a pretty high win rate. And once you do that, then you start to be able to build a culture that is recognizing that we learn through testing, and so we use data to inform our decisions, and anything that we don't know as a fact is an opinion, and we refer to them as hypotheses.
Amazing. Sean, could you tell me more about the North Star metric, why it is important and why we should track it?
Basically, if you have the wrong North Star metric, all of this falls apart. So the right North Star metric is really important. Essentially, what you're trying to do is quantify that product market fit that we talked about as being so important. So product market fit is I'm providing an important value to a specific type of customer. And if I can then quantify how much of that value and how many of those customers, that's going to be a good North Star metric. And then having the right North Star metric tied to value is ultimately going to lead to sustainable growth. So if I'm delivering more and more value to the right customers over time, those customers are going to keep coming back, and I'm going to be able to retain those customers. So the alternative is that a lot of companies get caught up in just looking at revenue, and they're more and more revenue. And if I need to trick customers to generate that revenue, so be it. If I make it really hard to cancel my product, then that's going to keep that revenue going. If I'm an ad supported product, if I start to put twice as many ads on every page, that's going to help my revenue. But ultimately, if you're hurting the customer experience and the value over time, that revenue is going to disappear. So what you want to make sure is that the amount of value that you're creating over time does not exceed the ramp of your revenue. And so that's why focusing on the North Star metric instead of a revenue metric is going to lead to more sustainable growth. Now, there's another benefit to it, is that revenue tends not to be very motivating for the team in the long run. It's just like, it's kind of a cold metric that people don't get excited to jump out of bed to say, MRR grew by this much, or, it's just top line revenue grew by this much. But to be able to say, like, let's say you're a solution that helps people live longer, like years added to lives is something that potentially could really be motivating for the team, or, and maybe not everything is going to be quite to that level. So even if you're like, for Uber, they're looking at weekly rides. And so again, the alternative might be, I want to look at app downloads. App downloads doesn't really create value, but knowing that in this week, we generated 50 million rides across our network, and 50 million people got where they needed to go, you start to kind of feel more of an emotional connection to that than just sort of a pure revenue number. And so I think that's another benefit, is that people connect to the mission a little bit more when it's a metric tied to value.
Yeah, I love this why perspective. Also, Simon Sinek talks about it a lot, why we are motivated, and that's definitely an important for the team, an important factor.
And in startups, like you need a lot of energy to keep working hard, and if you don't have a strong why, it just becomes harder and harder to keep putting that effort and energy into the business.
I have never understand why when you open Google and just look for examples of North Star metrics, a lot of results that you can find, they present something like revenue or market share as a North Star metric examples.
I think part of it is just people don't necessarily understand what a North Star metric is and why you need it. And so that's the problem with all of this, is that you have kind of differing opinions and people get upset around terminology. And, like ultimately I kind of think of this as more as sort of physics, like the physics of growth. How does growth actually work outside of the opinions of how growth works? And we're all working from the same set of physics. It's not like I like this physics better than that physics. And then trying to really understand growth on kind of a scientific level, and then how do you influence it, accelerate it? If you have the wrong understanding of the physics of growth, you unlikely are going to be able to influence and improve it very well if you don't really understand how it works. And so that's where the discussion should be, not on should we call it this or should we call it that? It should really be how does growth actually work?
Okay, so we have a scientific understanding of the principles of growth and how the value exchange happens and what products are for. And also we have a scientific process to test our ideas and then sustain this growth. And how does it all, or maybe it doesn't, differ when we are working with B2B products, large accounts or large contracts values, where cannot easily penetrate those companies with just usage?
Yeah. So for me, I love consumer for exactly the reason that you usually have a lot more data to work with, short sales cycles. You can iterate faster. To me, the nightmare would be I have a market size of 19 potential customers. It's 1 year sales cycles and $10 million transactions. That's probably where this approach is not going to add very much value. B2B, obviously could be anywhere from like a HubSpot is B2B, but you have a free product, and so that they can have tens of millions of users on a B2B product, where there's a upgrade cycle from a free version to a paid version. That starts to look a lot more like consumer. But I do even think like what you are starting to see more and more is that kind of consumerization of enterprise products. So in the past, it used to be, I sell a solution to an enterprise, and half the time, or probably even more than half the time, the person who bought the solution doesn't even pay attention if it gets used. And so we call that shelfware, and it wasn't even SaaS. So it's like, it doesn't matter if it gets used or not. It's just there. And maybe they upgrade when a new version comes out every few years, where I think what you've started to see, and Slack would be a great example here, where you provide something that's of value to the whole business, but you need to engage and retain users on the product the same way you would with a consumer product. It's just you're essentially defining the market size as the employee base within that company. And so like when Slack thinks about what is the aha moment for Slack, what's the point at which Slack becomes valuable enough that the business says, oh, this is great, I want to keep this long term. And it's going to be a function of use. It's when you have about 2,000 messages in Slack that it comes to life, to where you can start to see, people are using it for their communications, and now the search feature becomes more valuable, and grouping those messages becomes more valuable. And so for Slack, then the big goal is, I haven't really converted someone to Slack until I get a company to 2,000 messages. How do I get them to 2,000 messages? Either I significantly improve the average number of messages per person. So if I have 100 users and I get them to each send 20 messages, then that can get me there. Or I can have 1,000 users who each send 2 messages, but I might as well work both of those, get as many users on there as possible and get as many messages per user as possible, and that's going to get me to those 2,000 messages. But kind of just knowing that they don't really acquire that company until until it has provided enough value as a communication platform. And so I think that's what you're seeing even on big enterprise deals, that who are the end users of the products inside those organizations, and how do I make sure they're getting enough value to stay long-term retained on the product? And now you have the same process of improving those numbers as you would in a consumer product, where you're running some research. Why don't people send invites for Slack? Why don't they respond faster when a message is sent? And what are some experiments that we could run to improve the number of invites or improve the response rate to messages? And all of that is going to move you to a point where you are able to attract and retain and monetize more customers and sustainably grow the customer base.
Yeah, great. So the process is not that different. You can use the same method, the same thinking, the same principles to understand this on an account level.
Exactly.
Sean, if people wanted to find you, where they can find you?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is where I'm putting out most of my content these days. So just follow me on LinkedIn or connect with me on LinkedIn. But if you want to kind of learn more about what I'm doing with workshops and some other things, I have a website at seanellis.me where you can see that. And I'm about to kick off an around the world workshop and speaking tour in January, where I will. I'm not going to include much of Europe on this one, but it's gonna have a lot of Asia and South America and Australia, and so that's going to be about 100-day trip, and then later in the year I'll go and spend time in Europe, where I'll work with a number of companies in Europe as well. So probably more around May or June, I'll head to Europe. But hopefully, wherever your listeners are, hopefully we get a chance to connect in person. Otherwise, we've got the big wide virtual world to connect.
Okay, I will also put some links in the episode description. Thank you, Sean, for joining me today. Right, it was a pleasure.
Yeah, good to be on, Paul, and look forward to seeing this get published.
Great. Thank you. See you.
All right, see you.
Thanks for listening to the Product Compass podcast. Today we discussed the science of growth with Sean Ellis. Subscribe to my newsletter if you haven't already, hit the like button and share this episode with others so we can keep learning and growing together. Take care, Paweł.